The fault finder condemns himself. A person who's critical and not humble enough to admit their own faults, in the end, ends up condemning themselves. Romans chapter 2, as the Apostle Paul writes to Christians at Rome. In Romans chapter 2 and verse 1, Paul says, "Therefore you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things." We know that the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice such things. Do you suppose, O man, you who judge those who practice such things and yet do them yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God? See, the humble person admits their faults and looks for the good in those around them. We should never be discouraged when people find fault with us, because they will. There'll be those in the world who will find fault with us. They'll see what we're doing and they'll say that, well, this or that is lacking in your life. Matthew chapter 5. Again, we've looked at this chapter a moment ago, but let's look again at Matthew chapter 5. Look at verse 10. Matthew chapter 5, verse 10. "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." In life, you'll find it's impossible. It's impossible to please everybody. But what we can do is focus on what is right, what is just, and what is true. And we can do those things. As we wrap things up this evening, I want to turn to Galatians chapter 1 here. Galatians chapter 1 and verse 10, and see what the Apostle Paul says. Galatians chapter 1, verse 10, Paul says, For am I seeking the approval of man or of God? Am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations where we can't keep our family members or friends happy with us, and be pleasing to God at the same time. Paul found himself in that same situation. Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 17 of that chapter, puts it in his perspective and says this, For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. In closing thoughts, I think everyone here is probably familiar with my favorite artist, Norman Rockwell. Now think about how much humility and yet how much perspective Norman Rockwell had to do this very painting. Not only is it a painting of himself, but he's painting himself painting himself. Think about what Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians chapter 13. The very end of this book, the last chapter in verse 5, Paul says, examine yourselves. Before this meeting, next week, I want you to examine yourselves. Paul says, examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Or do you realize this about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you? Unless indeed you fail to meet the test. I hope you will find out that we have not failed the test. But we pray to God that you may not do wrong, not that we may appear to have met the test, but that you may do what is right, though we may seem to have failed. For we cannot do anything against the truth, but only for the truth. For we are glad when we are weak, and you are strong. Your restoration is what we pray for. For this reason I write these things while I am away from you, that when I come, I may not have to be severe in my use of authority that the Lord has given me, for building up and not for tearing down. I want you to focus on one thing. I want you to focus on passing God's test. Not my test, not your test. Passing God's test. Examine yourself. That's the reason I've got Norman Rockwell in this picture up here. Think about how easy it would be to want to draw your face a little bit nicer, to make yourself a little bit better as you draw a painting. The artist who's accurate will draw the truth. The Christian who's accurate in their assessment of themselves will see the places where we need to work on, the places we need to improve, and we'll make application to improve those. We won't try to cover them up. But as Jesus changes our lives, we will have the ability to change those places. In James chapter 1. James chapter 1, verse 22. James says, "But be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law of liberty and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing." When you look in God's mirror, what do you see? Do you see someone who's striving to follow Christ? Has God changed your life? Have you allowed God to shape, to mold you into his child? Or is there something still lacking? If you're here tonight, you're not a Christian, you haven't begun. You haven't begun the transformation. The transformation begins when we become a child of God. I would encourage you, if you have any needs tonight, to make those known as we take